Right, with that dramatic music, I'd like to invite the speakers to rise to the stage and to thank them in advance for what I know will be an absolutely memorable session. We've got Wolfgang Blau, who will be moderating the session, the director of MIT Media Lab, Joichi Ito, who will be the keynote, and ably assisted by Mohamed Nanabhay, and I'm sorry if I didn't say it quite right. But thank you to all three of you for...
Thank you so much for this kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, in the last 12 months, 2 events took place that are still helping us to re-understand the gathering of news and also the process of disseminating news. In December of 2010, events took place in Northern Africa that then turned into what we now call the Arab Spring, the Arab Summer, the Arab Revolution, or as Al Jazeera refers to it, the Arab Awakening. And in March of this year, we all witnessed this terrible earthquake that struck Japan, followed by a terrible tsunami, and then the catastrophe in the nuclear plants at Fukushima, which now turns out to be the arguably biggest and most costly industrial accident in history. From both of these regions, we have 2 key player and innovators with us today, Joichi from Tokyo, Japan, and Mohamed Nanabhay from Doha, Qatar. And let me briefly introduce them to you in more detail. In alphabetical order, Joichi is an influential thinker on the future of the internet. He's also a serial entrepreneur. He helped establish Japan's first internet service provider, Japan's first commercial search engine. He is also an early investor in, I think, around 40 startups. Some of them are household names like Flickr, Kickstarter, Last.fm, and also Twitter, which we will speak about a lot today. He also has served and is serving on numerous boards of influential nonprofits such as Creative Commons and the Internet Corporation on Assigned Names and Numbers, ICANN. And now most recently, I think in April, he was announced to be the new director of the legendary MIT Media Lab in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Please welcome Joichi. Mohamed Nanabhay is the head of new media at Al Jazeera English. He joined Al Jazeera in 2004, and he leads the team that is responsible for the outstanding and widely acclaimed online coverage of the Arab Awakening, which really impressed newsrooms around the world. Thank you very much again for this outstanding work, Mohamed. Before joining Al Jazeera, Mohamed worked for KPMG in South Africa. He studied international relations in Cambridge, UK, and computer science and history in Witwatersrand in Africa. Please welcome Mohamed Nanabhay. Mohamed, in starting, just to start with the basics, how does Al Jazeera benefit from social media in news gathering?
So I think, firstly, the framing of the question, I'd like to flip it around, because
Please.
It's not how Al Jazeera benefits from it. I think we need to really look at, when we're talking about social media, how society benefits from it and how everybody benefits. And I think this leads us to looking at an ecosystem that's formed between us as news providers, as well as the societies and the communities that we cover and we report on. And just this year, if you just take what's gone on in Tunisia, starting with Tunisia, we didn't have any reporters in Tunisia at the outbreak of their revolution. And all the footage that we had used initially had come through social media channels. And when you start thinking about this, and then you go to Egypt, and you look at the early days on the 25th of January as the revolution started unfolding, and you look at the media coming out of Egypt as well, even though they were journalists, what you saw in particular in Egypt, that most of the media that was consumed was produced totally through non-traditional channels and non-mainstream media channels. So what you saw was citizens, activists, people on the street producing media themselves, distributing that media totally outside traditional channels. So be it on YouTube, on Facebook, and other social networks. And that media initially being consumed by the audience, people looking for that content, and people sharing that content through their own networks and social networks, again, totally outside of traditional means. And what you saw on that day, on the 25th of January, was media being produced, specific video being produced. There's an iconic video of a youth standing in front of a water cannon. And this video was watched more than 3 million times. this video, marked the media euphoria that would take place over the next 18 days. And this video was distributed completely outside of traditional networks. It was completely on Facebook, people searching for it on YouTube and on the internet. So what we saw was citizens, people themselves, communities setting the agenda on their own. And this then started, a process where the mainstream media then came in and followed.
Can you tell us a little more about the size of your operations? Because I remember in our newsroom at Zeit Online, we kept watching you guys, and over time we thought this must be a huge team. He must have at least 50 people just for social media, and later on I realized that's not the case. How does your operation look like?
So our online operation has about 50 people in total looking at various aspects of our online output.
How many again?
50, 50. But of course, when we're talking about social media output, what you're really looking at is on a shift or on a news shift, maybe 5 or 6 people working across online news. So they'll be responsible for writing your news articles, gathering your news, as well as pushing it out onto Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and other social networks. But of course, that's only part of the story, because what we're also relying on is a large news gathering operation from our broadcast side of the business, who are on the ground feeding in news. And then, further amplifying voices on the streets and bringing those in as well. But, if you're just talking about who's dealing with social media, you're really looking at any one time a handful of people monitoring it, curating it, and pushing it out again.
I'd like to ask a question to both of you, Joey and Mohamed. The enormous benefit of social media for, I agree, society and also for newsrooms is undeniable. Yet one question for me seems unresolved at this point is if you ask a journalist what is a good, solid research, everybody has an answer. But if you ask how do you verify social media sources, we're still somewhat looking into the dark, or it's very foggy. What tools and also what methods so far do you see have proven valuable in verifying social media sources?
So I think, the methodology doesn't change, right, from depending on where the information source is. Just in the same way that a journalist would look to verify his normal sources, it would be the same with social media. Of course, the technology has changed a bit. So, for example, if you're looking at taking a piece of video, there's some pretty basic things you do when you get that video. You might try to verify the location by looking at landmarks.
How do you do that?
So, there's a number of things that we would do just straight off the bat. We'd look at landmarks in the video to see if we can confirm the location, if it's that place. We'd look at the weather and see if that tallies up with the weather we know in that location. We'd use our correspondents who are either in that city or who were in that city to try to verify, was it that building? We'd reach out to stringers, other people within that city, and find out, did this take place? Have you heard about this incident? And of course, then you try to double source it, whether that's through social media itself. And one of the things you can do quite easily is try to track down the source. So if somebody's posted something to YouTube, you can try to get in touch with that person and try to follow it to make sure you get to that source, get somebody on the phone, and try to verify that video. Of course, what you're always trading here is speed and accuracy, right? And that's become the huge challenge. So how quick do we get this news out versus how long does it take us to authenticate it? And that's always a balance that you're always working on and trying to find a way that satisfies the audience, but also satisfies your professional standards.
Joey?
And I think, very much like Mohamed says, I think it's what you traditionally do in a newsroom, except you have more resources. So when I was working, for instance, when I was following the Arab Spring stuff, I'm on the board of Global Voices. And we had a lot of regional blogger meetups leading up to the Arab Spring. So my regional editors know all of the bloggers in the region and which ones are reputable, which ones are not. And they can translate from Farsi, from Arabic, to English, to Chinese, to Japanese. And so whenever we see anything from a country, we can very quickly find out if this is a reputable blogger or not. I use Skype very actively, so I have everyone on Skype and chat. And so, for instance, when the Iranian revolution was going, or the election was going on, I just pulled Human Rights Watch, my Global Voices, and all of the nonprofits and the NGOs. I got them on Skype, I talked to them about it, and I got the Twitter guys on. So I can very rapidly pull groups together and experts together to try to vet stuff. And we can also, because I'm not a news journalist, I also do interventions. So if I want to send some information into the field, I can very quickly find somebody who can get it to where I want it to go. And so it's really so the point though is that we've all met each other face to face. So most of the people that I trust, I've had dinner with a lot of these guys in Tunisia and everywhere else. So it's all good old-fashioned human networking, but you just have a lot more tools now. And then the other part is that there are a number of people who are very, very, what do you call it? They make a hobby out of vetting information. And so it's about who you follow. I think it's very important not to follow just the hashtag. You know, don't follow Japan earthquake. You follow the 3 guys who are spending all of their time on the expertise around it. And what you do is when you see a photo and you see it on Twitter, you will immediately see these guys trying to figure out, you know, what's the background, is this for real? And they do analysis, and I have students at the Media Lab that do very, very deep technical analysis on, for instance, they can see if the image has been tampered with and things like that. And so the amount of resources you have in the internet, both technical and also regional, way exceed any kind of typical newsroom access. And so I think the trick for journalists is to plug into this network. So, for instance, Hiroko Tabuchi from the New York Times, she's in our network. And so she wasn't in Tokyo during the earthquake, but she got on the first plane to Japan. And so she was tracking all of her friends, and we were supplying her with information. And so I think it's really, you need to think of it as an extension of a typical sourcing network. But again, if you focus on those few people who are really focused on getting accurate information, there's a lot more signal there than there is noise.
We'll soon open the floor for your questions. I have one question to follow up. You have the privilege of a strong personal network of contacts, but which advice would you give to a newsroom in Oslo or in Zurich, Switzerland, on how to follow events in Japan or in the Arab Revolution with social media sources?
So I think one of the things that's quite, one of the benefits of social media is you're very quickly able to locate who the people are who are trusted in that region, right? So it's not hard to go onto Twitter and to find out who's the person with followers, who's making sense, who other people are quoting, retweeting, and talking about. And once you track down, like Joy said, there's 2 or 3 people, and you track them down, immediately you start mapping out a small network. And often people build lists of these other people. But what's also important to look at is how newsrooms can help each other. And sometimes, you know, just by a newsroom's posture, if the newsroom is open, you'd see all these benefits to other newsrooms. So for example, everything that we've done during the Arab Revolution, we've done it quite openly. So, you know, when we're looking at Egypt now, or looking at the election coverage, we're running live blogs that are showing you, you know, giving you minute-by-minute updates. So as soon as something drops, be that from our correspondents, somebody on the ground, something on YouTube, or even a wire, we're logging it in this live blog. So it's showing you the process of our journalism unfolding. And if, you know, you were a small newsroom somewhere, you just have to follow that live blog, and you'd see the story develop very quickly. So it's almost that you now have this news gathering resource at your disposal, and it's just because of the posture that we've taken. And I think, when we look at the Occupy Wall Street stuff, even though we've got correspondents, there's no way we can have as many people deployed as the New York Times, right, or some of the indie media networks. So we look at them and try to take a lead from what's going on in the ground. And I think that's important, just being able to change our posture and not be as inward-looking as we were in the past, because the world's a big place, and as your audience demands a more global, cosmopolitan coverage, you have to look outward. And we just don't have the resources to cover everything.
Very inspiring, thank you. Are there questions? Practitioners, this is your chance. Journalism students. And one important note, there is no stupid question. There are only courageous questions. Please. There's a microphone coming.
Hi, Iliko from LBI. I wondered, people talk about the fact that social media enabled things like Arab Spring. I wonder if you believe it enabled or actually made people go out onto the streets, or it was the reverse effect, that people saw people out on the streets and then tweeted about it.
I don't think, people have called this many things. People have called it the Twitter revolution, the Facebook revolution, the WikiLeaks revolution, the Al Jazeera revolution. I think all of those point to something, but none of them are quite accurate. This was an Egyptian revolution, a Tunisian revolution, a Libyan revolution. These tools played a part, definitely. But if you start digging deep into what was occurring in any of these countries, you're looking at decades of social turmoil, of oppression, So you're really looking at all these decades of suppression of people, right? You're looking at these regimes that were there, aging authoritarian regimes, and people building up resistance to them. If you look at Egypt in particular, over the last 10 years, you've seen the protest movement starting to build year on year, right? You're looking at the unions getting more active. So when you take all of this, you're looking at real people organizing in very traditional ways. But they often use new tools and new technologies to amplify the work that they were doing. So again, Egypt is an example. On that first day of the 25th of January, you saw the social media pick up. So you saw this group of activists, and they almost amplified their own voice within their communities. But when you look at internet penetration in Egypt, you're looking at a maximum of 20% in society. So they reached out broader than their own networks. But then once the mainstream media had come in, once Al Jazeera and others had come in to start cover this, you now reached 90% of society. And this provided an effect, right? So because as soon as those videos start making it onto the screen that everybody sees, you're starting more people come out. And this is almost a virtuous circle where people feel braver because they know the media is covering it. And if the media is covering it, it means hopefully there's some checks and balances on power. But I don't think you can just point to it's a social media revolution. But I think that gives you a hint of what's happening in society and the dynamics.
One more question here. No, there's a microphone coming for you.
Abdullah Al-Ahram, Egypt. I'm just asking you, Mr. Ito, you said you meet some of the bloggers who are using their work and you have lunch and so on. So the idea is, or my simple question is, what do you pay such people for providing you with information? And what do you think of this idea, paying people that are providing you with information that they call themselves bloggers and not professional journalists? And same question for Mr. Mohamed.
So those bloggers in Global Voices, none of them are paid. We have a few core staff who are editors who are paid, but most of the bloggers aren't paid. Most of the bloggers are actually activists of some kind. So they have a very strong social incentive to get the voice out and so on. And I think professional bloggers exist and they're fine, and some of them get paid. But I think traditionally in social media, the majority of the social media that I interact with, it's unpaid. I don't know. It's a good idea to pay them? It's not a bad idea, but I think that many of them don't even. They would rather not be paid. I think that. For instance, with Global Voices, we had a very long discussion about whether we should take money from the governments. We take the money from foundations, but especially the Tunisians felt that any money from any government would taint very much the authenticity of the movement, especially since they're activists, they're trying to change it. So many of the bloggers taking money creates this kind of relationship that they don't want. They want to say that they're providing it for free.
Please, Mohamed first.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you see with many of these bloggers, is that they don't start out trying to produce news. Right? That's not why they initially start blogging. Alaa Abdel Fattah, one of the Egyptian bloggers who's now in jail in Egypt, he's been under military arrest for probably 3 weeks now. A couple of years ago, he was at our Al Jazeera forum in Doha, and he said something interesting. He said, we're not journalists. We're not trying to be journalists, but at times we commit acts of journalism. Right, so so what you're looking at is now the role that people play with relation to media has changed. Everybody's walking around with their mobile phone and they're connected to Facebook and YouTube, and they're taking media. They're taking a photo, they're taking a picture, they're taking a video, and often that then turns into a source and something that would make it into a news package or be a source for news coverage.
You never paid any of them. You as Al Jazeera.
No, I mean you might pay people if they've come onto a talk show, but we don't go out to pay people. Necessarily. Yeah, and you curate this information and use it, and most of it is open, it's there. You'll find it on YouTube, you'll find it on Twitter, and so on.
Joey, for those of us who have not been covering Japan or working in Japan before the tsunami, the early days of the catastrophe have been very confusing, not just because the topic itself was so complicated and still is, but because the press conferences showed a news culture and a journalistic culture that's very different from what we're being used to in the US or EU. I've been live tweeting the first nights, the first TEPCO and government press conferences, and then at some point we just stopped covering them because there was no information in it for us. Has this catastrophe changed the perception of media in Japan itself?
So I think that that it's changed the perception of the establishment, which includes the media. So the government was hiding stuff, although they were also not understanding it as well. And then the media was just amplifying the non-understanding of the government. And then now, and there's several phases. So the first hours, one of the big problems was even the foreign media, because Japan isn't so popular these days, they didn't have many people there. So the press conferences were not populated with people who really understood what was going on. And in fact, the people, so what was happening was some of the press were streaming the press conferences to the internet so that amateurs could watch on Twitter. And we were actually getting better coverage through Twitter because we could listen over the headphones and understand more clearly than some of the people reading the stuff over the wire. And in fact, there were some mistakes that came out.
Microsievert and millisievert for days.
Yeah, well, actually one was when the government said that the staff of the reactor had temporarily retreated to a safer zone. One wire ran a story saying evacuated. And so everyone, including Al Jazeera, ran the story that the staff had evacuated. So I emailed Mohamed and I said, this is wrong. They're just in a temporary holding position. But since everyone had already amplified it, it was kind of crazy. So we had to wait for NHK to actually confirm that they had not evacuated. But so the first several hours, I think Twitter was key. And then after that, when it started to get a little bit more complex, I think the mainstream media started to do a little bit more of the analysis pickup. But then later, as we started to see the cover-up starting, the mainstream media wasn't digging, I don't think, very deep. And the problem was that the traditional sources were being kind of silenced. And I think today, I think the people are very, very disillusioned. I think there has been a huge loss of confidence, both in the media as well as in the official sources. The internet, again, is kind of, there's a lot of information there. It's hard to figure out what's going on because the facts are actually unclear, mainly because we actually don't scientifically know what the effect of radiation is on cancer that well. So the question is, everyone wants an answer where there isn't one. So there's a kind of fundamental problem.
Peter Franken gave an impressive presentation earlier about Safecast, your initiative. Can you tell us more about how Safecast influences or is being seen by Japanese media?
So it's like a human interest story. A bunch of foreigners coming around, helping the Japanese guys happy, you know, people being nice. That's kind of the story. And the problem right now is that in the newsroom, you need three types of people in the future. You need people who understand programming, people who understand data analysis, and people who understand statistics. And the problem is we have all of this data. We have over 1 million data points where you can see the source of the person, the equipment used, the time, and the measurement. And so often the media, for instance, I wrote a long letter to Hiroko, my friend at the New York Times, saying, you just wrote that this government measurement that some expert says that it doesn't agree with the data. If you had the skill and the time, you should have come and looked at our data and said, according to the data we see on the internet, it doesn't make sense. You know? And right now I don't think most media anywhere really has the kind of the practice of doing data analysis. But I think Safecast is a huge source of data. But I think this is, for me, a good time to push it, because in Japan, we need the journalists to look at the data rather than look for the experts, because most of the experts are actually biased. And so, especially in Japan, because most of the funding, obviously, for the experts come from the industry. And so it's very difficult to find those experts who can speak. But I think more broadly, if you look into the future, there's all kinds of data out there that journalists have access to now, government data, sensor data. And I think that Safecast is just one example of a kind of data source that should be used more actively, or could be used more actively by journalists. And you know, so at the Knight Foundation at Media Lab, we have students who are interested in journalism who know how to do data science. And so I think the key is going to be kind of like how you brought photographers and word processors into the newsroom and social media. I think data science is a new thing to pull into the newsroom. And what we're trying at Safecast very much is to try to work with journalists. But today it's still very difficult. They just like to tell the story of, you know, Peter and those guys driving around and making people happy.
We recently did a hackathon in Berlin with the Mozilla Foundation, and one of the young programmers put a post-it on the wall and it said, "The biggest problem in journalism is journalists." and I had to think of that posed it while listening to you, because I think you're absolutely right. Question only is, how do we train, how do we retrain our newsrooms, how do we even interest our newsrooms for such skills? Which advice could both of you give to practitioners here, chief editors, newsroom managers, on how to train our newsrooms, not just for dealing with social media, working with social media, but also the skills that Joy just described?
I think one of the key things, that you need in your newsroom is, the ability to inspire curiosity in your journalists, right? If you have a curious journalist, he's going to go out and dig and find things. And, to enable that, in a newsroom that's very fast-paced, especially when you start looking at live news, broadcast news, and, newspapers with tight deadlines and online newsrooms, it's very difficult for people to step back and start thinking about a story that's further than their deadline. And part of the role of editors should be to always allow their journalists to step back, do a bit of thinking, do a bit of digging in a story, to see, to go beyond the wires, to go beyond the press release. And I think just that, and that's sort of the basics. When you start thinking of what makes a good journalist, it's that ability to think critically about a problem, to question authority, and to be a problem solver. And those sort of basic skills don't change. The environment may have changed. It might be more fast-paced now. We might have access to new tools and technologies. But if you have a curious mind and you have some time to attack a problem, that's what you really need.
And I would suggest trying to get some interns. Go to technical universities and get a programmer, get a statistician or a data visualization student, and have them, spend lunches with the journalists to try to show them, this is what we can do, this is what we can do. And because I think journalism is a really interesting business, interesting profession. And I know a lot of young students who are great programmers who are looking for something to do. And I think if you became, one of the leading, it's kind of like the photojournalists. I think that early days, these guys were kind of inventing this new form. I can imagine 2 or 3 programmers, data guys, inventing the field of data journalism, and if you kind of get them excited about that and give them the resources and mentor them, I think that they could become kind of like a new kind of thing.
Do any of you here in this hall know journalism schools that seem to prepare future journalists for this new environment? Please, volunteer, tell me. Just shout it out. Which schools do that?
Hi, my name is Guido Baumhauer, Deutsche Welle. Deutsche Welle has a school which is International Media Studies, and we do run a course on data journalism or data-driven journalism, and here we run our first courses, and we find it pretty difficult to introduce all journalists who came to us to learn the true journalism, to tell them, well, to learn true journalism means to have to deal with data and have to visualize things and try new things out.
I asked this question also in some social networks. I was told that the Medical School of Journalism in Chicago is pretty cutting edge, training programmers to become journalists to become programmers of some kind. Jeff Jarvis's City University in New York. Dan Gilmore, of course, who is here at the Cronkite School. And I was also told that the City University in London has an outstanding course on interactive journalism. Are there other schools to look at? Please, there's a microphone coming right to you here.
The University of Hong Kong here is making some pioneering efforts. It's very hard to recruit programmers or students with computer science background to learn about journalism, but we think that is a better way to do, instead of training journalists to learn about computing. So we're ready to announce scholarships in the graduate program for computer science students to come to the program, learn about journalism, and with courses in advanced computing. And I absolutely agree. And in our undergrad program, we made Introduction to Statistics a required course in the first year. They cry and moan, the student, they don't like it, but we said, sorry, you have to do it. Thank you.
Can you tell again the name of your university and the class so we can put that online?
I think it's Hong Kong University, right?
The University of Hong Kong, and our department is the Journalism and Media Studies Center.
Thank
and
you.
I think in the U.S., Medill at Northwestern is doing it.
Yes.
Columbia is doing it. Columbia
Yes, Emily
J
Blau.
School. Yes.
Great, thank you. There's one question in the back row.
And
2 questions actually, lady in front, gentleman in the back first. or the lady first, you are right. Good impulse.
Okay, hi, my name is Ksenia Fedorova. I'm from RT News Channel. We are based in Moscow. I just wanted to add that we have something similar like Deutsche Welle, but what we do is a 3-day seminar for journalists because we do use a lot of social media and new media, and we share our experience on a non-commercial basis. So basically it's like a cooperation, and 3-day seminar, we show the insight on how RT uses social media and what you can do in this field.
Quick comment. I noticed in my work with my own newsroom and in talking to many other chief editors that many journalists are actually curious about social media, but somehow have this fear that by using social media, promoting the use of social media, they might render themselves obsolete in the long run, which is a funny proposition, but I still think this cultural fear seems to stand in the way of this transformation of our newsrooms. This question is not, you don't have your question anymore? Good. Please.
I'm Bambang Harimurti from Tempo, from Indonesia. If you watch all news portals, they always have what we call the most popular articles and editor's choice. And they are two separate things. How do you explain this? Thank you.
So I think, the simple answer is, as journalists, and I'm sure as most of you in this room would believe that, as editors, you have some prerogative in choice, in story selection. That's your job, right? You're trying to set the news agenda. You're trying to distill a wide variety of information and give it some order and provide some order to the world. So when your audience comes to your website or to your newspaper, you've set priorities for them and you've laid out what you think they should know. Now, of course, on the internet, things don't work that way, right? We become so disintermediated from our front pages and from the editors that many people are hitting our news sites without ever going to the front page. They may only come to a news site once and never come back because they found a link on Facebook or on Twitter and so on. And often, because of that, your most viewed lists are running havoc because, it might be something that trended on dig.com or some other social media website and then drove up a story. So, I think it's interesting when you start looking at those lists. And I often do this. I go to many of the news websites and try to look at the lists. But often I find those lists, if you follow them, you'll see you racing to the bottom with these lists on many websites. And you'll find that celebrity news, gossip, always trends to the top, just because those are things that usually trend widely. And I think that's slightly worrying. Because if you took that blindly without understanding the statistics and the numbers behind it and how you got to those numbers, it could lead you down a path of becoming very superficial and very shallow in the journalism that you do. Because, one of the tough calls that you need to make as newsrooms is that prerogative that, you paid for as an editor is still important. That's why, we often make a conscious choice to report on Africa because it's underreported. So we'll make sure that we report on Africa, even though we know that it's not going to drive numbers on our website. And we keep those numbers away from our journalists, just so they don't feel disheartened, but also that they don't run away from these stories. And I think that's quite important as well. You have to balance where your audience is. On the other hand, we use those numbers proactively as well. So when the Arab Revolution started with Egypt, we suddenly saw the numbers on our website start changing. Even though our lead story on the 25th of January was something different, we were leading with the Palestine papers, an investigation we had worked on for months. We saw the audience had shifted completely to Egypt on that day. And we had live numbers telling us this. So we quickly turned around our own news, started deploying journalists into Cairo. So I think you have to use that data in different ways, and you have to use it wisely. But I think it can lead you to making some great editorial choices that can put you ahead of your competition, but it could also lead you to a path that's not that good and quite shallow. So you have to be quite smart in thinking about those numbers.
Joey, I would like to speak briefly about the role that technology plays. I agree with what Clay Shirky says, that it's not technology that causes revolutions, but mass changes of behavior. But still, now in looking at how our traffic is being allocated between mobile devices, tablets, and desktop PC website, we see very different behavior, very different preferences in what people like to read at what times of day. And so we still see technology has a massive impact, not to mention even the impact of mobile news gathering. In your function as director of the MIT Media Lab, what might you be able to see on the horizon of new technologies or new technological behaviors affecting our news business?
So I think the main one would be what I said earlier, which is the data science and things like that. But as part of data science, just listening to Mohamed, I think that there are lots and lots of interesting technologies around what we, for instance, a similar technology to what Amazon is using for recommendations and things like that. There's a lot of different technical ways to dampen out noise. So for instance, you could say all the links from one single Facebook post, we will filter those out, or we'll amplify these, or we'll amplify that. And right now, it's kind of in the domain of geeks. But I think that what's going to happen is it's going to become more accessible, and so that it's going to be easier and easier to understand the data and then to tune it a little bit more, instead of having this kind of chaotic mess that just turns into noise. And so that's, I think that's one thing. I think that there's a lot of very interesting things around privacy-enhancing technology, and to try to, for instance, have pseudonymous communications, to make sure you're talking to the same person over and over again, but not necessarily revealing their identity. And so in certain places where they're at risk. And then we're also deploying a lot of technologies that right now, for instance, in Syria, it's very difficult because the minute you identify yourself, you're putting people's lives at risk. And so right now, a lot of the technology is for human rights defenders. So at Witness and at Mozilla and other places, we're trying to create tools for human rights defenders. But a lot of these tools for human rights defenders also are important tools for people who read and write news. And for instance, I think in Syria, Facebook is blocked, but I think it's like the second or third most popular website in Syria, and so obviously these circumvention tools are happening. And so again, it depends on the country, but I think in a lot of countries where it's very difficult to get news from or to, there's going to be a lot of interesting circumvention tools. And there's a good book by Rebecca McKinnon called The Consent of the Network, which should be coming out next year. And it's really about taking these social media companies and also the hardware, software companies and making them responsible for the effect that they have on things like news and human rights. And it's really kind of taking John Locke's notion of consent of the governed and saying, well, if you're running the infrastructure of the network, you must also have the consent of the people using it. So this isn't directly related to news, but news plays a very important role in taking these companies and making them accountable. And those things, for instance, like a device, like a mobile device, we may start, just like you ask companies about the ecological impact of this device. You may say, what is the media impact of this device? What is the, you're only showing entertainment, news, blah, blah, blah. You must be responsible for this or that. So that's another thing I think we'll see coming.
Unfortunately, we'll have to wrap up already. In closing, very brief answers. Mohamed, Joey, what was a phenomenon, a story, an incident this year that inspired you the most about the future, not of journalists, but of journalism?
I think for me it was the night Mubarak stepped down, and watching the crowds in Tahrir simultaneously live. We've been watching this for 18 days, 24/7, and we've been watching the square. And to see it erupt on that evening when the announcement that Mubarak was stepping down came, I think that was just an awe-inspiring moment for people around the world. And when you watch that echo live on television and watch it then go around the world on Twitter, you saw that something fundamental had changed in the way we communicate.
Thank you. Joey?
So this is not so much journalism, but I remember when the earthquake happened, it was exactly, I think, when Libya was kind of going crazy. And there were some Libyans who said, who were actually at huge risk, sent strong wishes to the Japanese and this feeling of solidarity. And to imagine that these people in Libya who are running for their lives, caring about the Japanese citizens with the tsunami, to me what that gave me the sense was that you can transmit courage and you can transmit some kind of emotion over the network by providing voice in a new way that you couldn't normally do through just print, for instance.
Joey, Mohamed, thank you for your contributions. Thank you very much for your contributions to journalism, to democracy, and thank you for coming to Hong Kong.
Thank you for the second time. It was very inspiring. So now I'm asking Bob Picard, the moderator of the